The Cua Viet is not a large river. It runs some 8 miles from the sea to the crossing at Dong Ha, brown and slow between low banks, wide enough for a landing craft and not much more. In the spring of 1968, almost everything that lived north of that crossing came up it. Ammunition, fuel, rations, mail, the barrels for the guns. There was one highway and one river, and the highway had been cut in its western reaches since the year before. At the end of April, a division of the North Vietnamese army came down toward that water. It did not come as a raid. It came in regiments with artillery behind it in the zone, and it stopped in a line of hamlets on the north bank, 3 kilometers from the crossing. There were 6 of them, strung along a mile of river and stream, and one carried the name the rest of them would be remembered by: Dai Do. Villages of earth walls and bamboo hedges, standing a few feet above the paddy on ground that stayed dry. 1 battalion of Marines was sent to take them back. It took them one at a time, over 3 days, and each morning it had fewer men to do it with than the morning before. This is the story of those 3 days, told slowly. What the ground was, why the river mattered more than any of the villages, and what was still standing when it was over. Before we settle in for the night, if long, quiet history like this helps you rest, a like or a subscription helps. The Long Watch reach other people who fall asleep to the past. An episode like this one takes weeks of reading and assembling, and that one small tap genuinely keeps the watch going. Now get comfortable. Nothing in the next 2 hours needs to be remembered, and the story does not travel far. It moves from one village to the next along a mile of riverbank, and it comes back to the same water every time. The ground comes first, because the ground is most of the reason any of it happened where it did. Quang Tri was the northernmost province of South Vietnam, and one of the smallest, some 1,800 square miles, 45 miles north to south, and 40 east to west. Its interior rose to the west in jungled ridges, the highest of them near the Laotian border. The eastern half was different country altogether, a narrow coastal plain, and behind it a belt of low rolling hills. In the north, the Ben Hai River marked the boundary with North Vietnam. The demilitarized zone was 6 miles wide, followed the trace of the river 30 miles inland, then ran in a straight line to the Laotian border. Both the zone and the ground beyond it gave the North Vietnamese army places to gather units and position artillery. Where the coastal plain met the river that drained it, a highway and a road crossed. The crossing was called Dong Ha, 8 miles below the zone. 2 roads met there. A river route ended there. Almost everything that lived and fired north of that point had first passed through it. Route 1 was the main north and south highway of the country. Southward, it connected Dong Ha and the provincial capital to Phu Bai and Da Nang. Northward, it crossed the water on a concrete bridge and ran on toward the zone, over flat ground and paddy, past the hamlets that stood along it. The other road ran west. Route 9 was the major east-west line of communication in the province, and in its western reaches little more than a mountain path. It followed the valley of the Cam Lo River, and road and valley together were the 2 most strategic east-west arteries in the sector. Since August of 1967, the road had been cut west of the outpost at Ca Lu, and had stayed cut. Of the 3 ways into the north of the province, one had been closed for 9 months. 2 were left, the highway and the river. From the air, the base was a sprawl of matting and revetment with an airstrip through the middle of it. There was also a town of the same name, older than the base, and the South Vietnamese regiment that held the ground north of the crossing kept its command post in it. The 3rd Marine Division had brought its forward command post up from Phu Bai at the turn of the year. It was one of the largest divisions in the history of the Marine Corps. More than 24,000 men in 5 infantry regiments and an artillery regiment, Army gunners, Navy logistic forces, and Seabees worked alongside it. The artillery regiment kept its command post at Dong Ha as well, and fired from positions there, at Camp Carroll and at Zo Lin. One of the infantry regiments had its command post on the same ground, and so did the South Vietnamese regiment in the town. 4 headquarters within a few hundred meters of one another. What was not there was infantry. The units at the base itself were support units, the logistic group, the truck companies, the people who moved and repaired things. For all the importance of the place, it was open to a determined attack, and the nearest troops were the South Vietnamese battalions of the regiment in the town. Behind them stood the division's reserve, one small force named after the nickname of the colonel who commanded it. A rifle company, an armored company with its tanks, 2 army gun tracks called dusters, a platoon of ontos, a platoon of engineers. For the most part, even this modest force was committed somewhere else. Just above the town, 3 separate operations came together. West of the highway, 1 regiment worked its own area. East of it, another held the sector running down to the sea, with the amphibian tractor battalion and a battalion landing team under it. Between them, along both sides of the road up to the zone, stood the South Vietnamese. 3 commands, 3 sets of boundaries, changed only occasionally and only after negotiation. The North Vietnamese were well aware of where those lines ran and were not slow to make use of them. On the map, the base sat at the southeast corner of a quadrilateral. The Marines had named Leatherneck Square, Cam Lo, Con Tien, Zo Lin, and Dong Ha itself. For control, the division had divided the ground into regimental and battalion areas, each with a code name. Kentucky in the square, Lancaster to the west, Napoleon along the river to the sea. Under Napoleon, the amphibian tractor battalion was responsible for keeping the waterway open. Something else sat at Dong Ha that the maps did not show. The Marine Direct Air Support Center for the sector was there, call sign Landshark Bravo, with the Fire Support Coordination Center in the same compound. North of the zone, control passed to an Air Force reporting post called Waterboy. In and south of it, Marine Flight Control went by Vice Squad. The Air Force kept a permanent liaison team in the same room, called Jazzy Control, with a radio link around the clock to the command aircraft orbiting the sector. The reason for the whole arrangement was the airspace. Guns and aircraft could not use the same sky at the same time, and the rule was written down. When aircraft needed a piece of it, the command aircraft suspended the authority to fire there. That order went through the center at Dong Ha. Minimum time, minimum ground. To put aircraft over a hamlet, someone in that room stopped every gun that could reach it. Everything the sector could see fed into the same place. Ground patrols and photo reconnaissance. Airborne infrared and side-looking radar. Surveillance radars. Seismic sensors. Night observation devices and searchlights. All of it arriving as lines on paper in one room beside the airstrip. The guns to the north could reach it, and they knew the ground. Their adjustment of fire onto American positions was often inaccurate. Onto Dong Ha, it was not. The gunners worked from French military maps of the province, and the colonel who commanded the Marine artillery said afterward that they could put a round wherever they chose. One officer at the base wrote that this went beyond what anyone would call harassing fire. The guns often fired when aircraft were landing or taxiing to take off. By registering in advance on the strip, a first round might take an aircraft with it. They were selective and did not fire enough to give their own positions away. A few rounds into that base might also find an ammunition dump, and twice they did. In the autumn of 1967, most of the ammunition and fuel dump burned. On the 26th of February, some 400 rounds put direct hits on the airfield and the logistic compound. They destroyed 2 light observation aircraft, a dump, and 20,000 gallons of diesel. Through all of it, the base worked. In April alone, nearly 63,000 tons of supplies came in by sea at the port facility at the river mouth and went up the water to Dong Ha. That was after a new base at Quang Tri and a beach further south had taken some of the load off. The ramp where all of it came ashore stood beside the concrete bridge that carried the highway north across the water. From there to the sprawling base and its airfield was 3/4 of a mile. It had begun as a graded slope for wheeled lighters. By that spring it was hard-surfaced, widened to take 6 landing craft at once, and lit at night. Below the ramp the water turns east and goes to the sea. It was not a wide river, brown, silted, twisting between low banks and paddy, shallow enough in places to matter to a loaded hull. From the ramp down to the estuary was about 10 kilometers, and that short stretch carried the northern province. The water has more than one name. The Vietnamese called it the Hue Giang. The American name came from the name of the river mouth, Cua Viet, which means south mouth. Just above Dong Ha, the same water was the Dieu. The 2 channels came together about 3 kilometers northeast of the base. Ships could not use it. Tank landing ships drew too much for a silted channel. For a while, everything came north from Da Nang in landing craft. 90 miles of open sea, 10 to 12 hours in convoy in good weather. In the northeast monsoon, with swells of 10 to 16 feet, the same passage took 24 hours, and sometimes 36. There were never enough of the craft for that. In the autumn of 1966, the Navy decided that if ammunition by the boatload would not feed the guns, it would come in the big ships instead, which meant dredging the bar across the mouth so the ships could enter. A small Canadian suction dredge started the cut, working beside a drag line run out from a pier. Between them, they scratched a channel wide enough for the Army's hopper dredge to come up from the delta and finish it at 15 feet. The facility at the mouth opened in March of 1967 and unloaded beached ships around the clock when the work demanded. From there, the cargo went up the last miles by boat. The utility landing craft did most of it, a flat, blunt, open-welled hull, redesignated as a harbor craft when it grew old and kept working. Wheeled amphibious lighters of 5 and 15 tons swam out to anchored boats and drove ashore with the load. At the Dong Ha ramp, forklifts met them. One photograph of that ramp catches what the lifeline carried on an ordinary day. A craft alongside, laden with drums of asphalt. Fuel came by pipe. When weather put the sea line out of service, the small tankers steamed into the estuary, where there was some shelter, and pumped directly to bladders on the beach. How much was kept there can be counted from what burned. Artillery hit the base at the mouth on the 10th of March and set off 150 short tons of ammunition. The fire took a mess hall and a communications van. It took 47 of the 64 sites holding fuel bladders. The dependence was not a preference. With most of the main roads cut that winter, the lifeline of the northern forces rested more and more on the sea. In February, more than 45,700 tons went by ship from Da Nang to Dong Ha. In the same month, 342 tons arrived there by air. Even so, the division reported that its supply requirement fell short, and shipments were limited to what was called combat essential. Barrier construction stopped. In mid-February, the division received 3 days of shipments of cement and culverts, and its commander sent an angry message asking for the cement to be delayed in favor of food and ammunition. The river had its own rules. Traffic ceased at dusk because of hostile fire and because there were no navigational aids on it. Air cover was effective in daylight, and vessels could make the run up to Dong Ha in comparative safety while the light held. After dark, the water was empty. 3 things could close it, and all 3 were used. Fire from the northern bank, where the ground came down to the water. Mines in the channel. Artillery from north of the zone, adjusted by observers who could see the river. None of it was theoretical. One landing craft set off a mine that exploded behind it, stayed afloat, and lost both engines. The boat that came out to tow it home took fire from the northern bank. Another struck 2 mines on one run and was towed back to port. Each time the commander at the mouth closed the river until a demolition team from Dong Ha could sweep it. In January, the closures came often enough to reach the top. The commander of the Marine Amphibious Force radioed the division that an interruption to the river line of communications was unacceptable. Then he said what followed from it. Mines and ground fire against shipping could only come from the banks, and the banks were to be cleared at once. That was the whole logic of the ground fighting on this river. A patrol boat cannot hold a bank. Whoever wanted the water open had to hold the hamlets along it, the paddy behind them, and the tree lines a mortar would otherwise use. The Navy built its own answer in February. Task Force Clearwater was established under the Marine Amphibious Force to coordinate river traffic and convoys. With a Navy captain commanding, it had 2 rivers to keep open. This one and the water that gave the city of Hue its access to the sea. It began with 20 river patrol boats, reinforced with monitors, armored river craft, air-cushioned craft, and minesweepers. Its headquarters never came ashore. Mobile Base 2 was a floating barge complex, first at Tan Mi, and then moved north to the mouth of the Cua Viet. The force organized into 2 groups, and the northern one carried both names, the Dong Ha and Cua Viet Security Group. The patrol boats were small and fast, 4 men, water jet pumps instead of screws, 25 to 29 knots, surface radar, 4 machine guns, and a grenade launcher. Attached to the force were people who did not belong to the Navy at all. A Marine searchlight battery and signalmen from the Army. In March, 10 armored troop carriers and 3 monitors came north to join them. On the 8th of March, the Navy announced that the Cua Viet was open and that shipping no longer needed to move in convoy. That announcement described a moment and not a year. Heavily armed convoys remained the way the line was worked, and the watch kept on that water stayed a thin one. The tractors were part of it too. Marines moving up the river on amphibian tractors piled sandbags on the holes against explosive rounds. And as a precaution against mines and rockets, the infantry rode on top rather than inside. Coming down into the water, a tractor made a great deal of noise and very little speed. Most of the convoyed vessels completed the trip without incident. That was the ordinary outcome, and it stayed the ordinary outcome. A loaded hull going up in the morning, a shallow brown river, banks close on both sides, and the traffic stopping when the light went. On the 4th of January, the battalion went aboard 4 ships of the 7th Fleet, the Cleveland, the Comstock, the Wexford County, and the helicopter carrier Iwo Jima, with a Marine helicopter squadron riding on her. 2 days later, they sailed for the Philippines. The 2nd Battalion of the 4th Marines had spent the end of the old year guarding an airfield in Quang Tri Province, and now it belonged to the fleet. What it had become was a battalion landing team. An infantry battalion sat at the center, and around that came artillery, tanks, amphibian tractors, engineers, and a reconnaissance platoon. The pieces needed to put a battalion on a beach and keep it alive there. With its helicopter squadron, the landing force came to about 2,000 men, carried on the ships of a Navy amphibious group. 2 such forces worked the Western Pacific, Alpha and Bravo, under a brigade headquartered on Okinawa. This battalion was the infantry of Alpha. Its rear headquarters stayed aboard the Iwo Jima through the spring, and much of what it ate and fired came out to it through the Navy, whatever regiment it was working for ashore. The man who commanded it was Lieutenant Colonel William Weiss, and he took it on the 3rd of January. He described ground the way a map describes it. This river runs east from that town and empties into that 3 kilometers northeast of the crossing. Kilometers, directions, and almost no adjectives. 4 rifle companies made the infantry of it. Echo belonged to Captain James Livingston, Foxtrot to Captain James Butler, Golf to Captain Manuel Vargas, Hotel to Captain James Williams. By the table of organization, a Marine infantry battalion came to about 900 men. What it had in hand on a given morning was another matter, and depended on who else wanted its pieces. Those pieces went early. Each time the team came ashore, most of its supporting elements were detached on the spot, the Ontos platoon, the amphibian tractors, and handed to other commands. Tanks moved the same way. 5 of them were taken off the landing force that winter and given to a battalion up the road. On the 22nd of January, the battalion landed at Camp Evans and took over the ground from another battalion. 4 days later, the order came to re-embark. Everything it had ashore was back aboard its shipping in 5 hours and 15 minutes, and the landing force commander thought that worth writing down. The next landing came on the 27th. A little after 9 in the morning, the squadron put the first wave into a zone beside a combat base on the road, and by evening the whole team was ashore and working for another regiment. The day after that it moved again, north into the ground around Con Tien. The offensive at the end of that January closed the amphibious part of the year, with enemy forces massing in the north, and then with Tet, the landing battalions became for all practical purposes part of the force ashore. They still had ships. They were used as infantry wherever the division had a hole. On the last day of the month, the division cut the battalion in half. 1 command group with 2 companies went west to Camp Carroll and worked for the 4th Marines. The others stayed east under the executive officer. The general expected a blow at the bases along the western road, and he wrote down the name of the formation he expected it from. It was the 320th Division, and that was February in another part of the province. Early in March, the battalion changed places with another landing battalion. Helicopters carried that one west to Camp Carroll and brought this one east to the Cua Viet. The 2 swapped ground, and with the ground they swapped problems. It was this battalion's first month on the river. What the river cost showed on the 18th, in an abandoned hamlet about 1,000 meters from Nhi Ha. The enemy was dug in there with fields of fire laid out for his machine guns and artillery reaching him from north of the demilitarized zone. 3 companies worked at that hamlet all day and did not take it. They walked in the next morning after the guns and the aircraft and found it empty. The lesson a neighboring commander drew from that spring was short. Assume every village is built the same way and go in with enough men to finish quickly. Villages there had earth walls thrown up over generations, hedgerows too thick to see through at 3 paces, and bunkers under the houses. From 1,000 meters out, they looked like a line of trees. At the end of March, the battalion went north as bait. A task force of Marines, an Army armored cavalry squadron, and 2 South Vietnamese battalions attacked toward the demilitarized zone near Zo Linh, met little, and reached its objectives the first day. The object was not the ground. The object was that the enemy should watch the coast while something was prepared in the west. That squadron had been working under the Marine Division since early March. Army armor and Marine infantry had shared this ground for a month. April was quiet. The pace in the coastal sector fell away after the diversion, and for the rest of the month there was scattered shooting and little else. Wace thought things had calmed down where he stood because the enemy had shifted his main effort west into the South Vietnamese area. It was a reasonable thing to think. The command post stood at Mai Sa Chan, at the southern end of a creek the Marines had named Jones Creek because the maps gave it no name. The creek ran north out of the demilitarized zone into the Cua Viet. Foxtrot Company lived there with the headquarters. Inland the ground went to dunes and thin sandy soil. Along the creek and the river it went to rice. Rice growers lived in the hamlets on the banks and just above them. Some of those hamlets stood empty by that spring. The fields still were worked the old way, in water and mud, with earth dikes between them, a foot or 2 of dried clay, wide enough to walk single file, high enough that a man could lie behind one out of sight. In 4 months the battalion had worked for 5 commanders and lived in 7 places. Twice it had come off the beach and gone back to the ships. Once it had been cut into halves that could not see each other. Its tanks and tractors belonged to somebody else whenever somebody else needed them. By the end of April, it held a command post at Mai Sa Chan and its rifle companies in 4 places. 1 north beyond the creek, 1 east along the river, 1 out on patrol, 1 away west under orders that did not come from Waisa. On a map the battalion was 1 mark. On the ground it was spread across a sector in pieces. Mai Sa Chan was the place they came back to. Companies loaded onto amphibian tractors there and went out. Companies walked in at night off a trail and slept where they lay down. Landing craft took them off the bank in the morning. Whatever the battalion was told to do in that sector, it started and ended on the same few hundred meters of ground beside the water. April on the coastal plain was quiet in a way that cost nothing to notice. The river ran its convoys. The shelling from north of the demilitarized zone came and went, and the sector's fighting was somewhere else. All that spring, the weight of the war in this corner of the country had been moving west into the hills and the mountains, and it had taken the moving parts of the war with it. The command in the north had a plan for that spring, and the plan had 3 parts. The first was the relief of Khe Sanh, which had finished in the middle of April, the fighting there going on afterwards under a new operation name. The second was a raid into a valley near the Laotian border. The third was to be a clearing attack into the demilitarized zone itself. The second part went in on the 19th of April, after 2 days of heavy bombing. Brigades of 2 American divisions with a South Vietnamese airborne group landed in the A Shau Valley in the mountains. What the valley held was not a garrison but a supply route, and clearing it took a month. For that month, the Corps had its mobile divisions in the hills. The third part never happened. The attack into the demilitarized zone was overtaken, in the account written afterwards, by the enemy moving first and moving in strength at Dong Ha. What happened at the end of that April happened on the ground where an American offensive was to have begun, and it happened to the units that had been left there. To cover what had gone west, the Corps borrowed. An Army Light Infantry Brigade came north on the 22nd of April and sat at Camp Evans as the Corps Reserve. A week earlier, it had been fighting in another part of the country. It came north because the mobile divisions were in the mountains. A Marine regiment had come out of the west in the middle of April to the base at Quang Tri and was being put back together. Its artillery, its trucks, its generators, nearly all its heavy equipment had been shot up or left behind. Until it had those things again, it was guarding rice south of the base. On paper, it was a regiment in reserve. In fact, it could not go anywhere. The formation moving into the eastern sector had a number and a history. American intelligence called the 320th an elite unit and a veteran of the campaign of 1954 at Dien Bien Phu, newly arrived in the demilitarized zone. It had come into the sector over the winter, taking the place of another division, and the staffs had been sure of that much for months. It was not new to this ground. In December, the intelligence maps put it near Camp Carroll and Cam Lo. By the middle of January, it appeared to be preparing to attack Camp Carroll, and its first work on this front came on the 24th of that month. An ambush on an artillery supply convoy, 3 trucks and a jeep with a machine gun mount, in the early afternoon, 3 kilometers from the wire. What the Americans knew about the division came through 3 channels, and the history names them plainly: prisoner interrogations, captured documents, agent reports out of the sector. Every sentence written that spring about what the enemy intended rests on one of those 3, and each of them arrives late, in pieces, and about whichever unit the prisoner had come from. By these means, the division staff knew that elements of the 320th had infiltrated into the eastern sector. It knew, vaguely, what they were for: to interdict the Cua Viet. That was the whole of it. A division moving east, and a purpose written in one verb, over ground where every gallon of fuel and every crate of ammunition north of the town came up the water. What the staff did not know was that the arriving was already over. Along the river, the regiments had been meeting squads and platoons, a company now and then, north and east and west of Dai Do. The most recent contacts pointed away to the northwest, and that is where the main effort was expected. The map was being read carefully. It was the wrong part of the map. Sometime in the previous days, at least 4 North Vietnamese battalions had come south, out of the demilitarized zone, through the sector held by a South Vietnamese regiment, and into the cluster of hamlets on the peninsula above the river. The ground there is flat and it is open. Nobody saw them. They did not arrive and then dig. In a short time they were in defenses the history calls formidable. Bunkers roofed with several feet of earth over legs of bamboo, camouflaged into the hedgerows, tied together by trenches and fighting holes. Small parties had been coming into the area for a long time before that, and the positions had been laid out to a plan and built by other hands for troops who would arrive later and move in. Dai Do stood about 2.5 kilometers from Dong Ha, and Dong Ha held the Marine Division's command post, its bridge, and its airfield. 4 battalions had put themselves inside that distance, under earth, in villages that a regiment was responsible for, and a river ran past. They had been in place some days before anyone looked. Warning came, and it came in the right words. During the last week of April, the naval task force that convoyed the river received reports that the enemy meant to interdict the waterway, and on the 27th it told the force headquarters so. In the same days, the guns north of the demilitarized zone increased their fire on Dong Ha and on the port at the mouth of the river. On the afternoon of the 29th it started. Sappers blew a culvert on the road about 6 kilometers north of Dong Ha. The 320th attacked the South Vietnamese regiment and attacked the Marines in the sector to the west at the same hour. The road north out of the town stopped being a road. The South Vietnamese regiment sent 2 battalions at the break, one up from the town and one down from a strong point to the north, to close on whatever was between them. They met resistance they reported they could not handle, and they asked for help. The help was the division's only reserve, and it had a name of its own, Task Force Robbie, after the colonel who commanded it. A tank company, a rifle company, a few army tracks with automatic cannon, engineers, a platoon of ontos. It had been built in February to go in any direction at any time, and most of the time some part of it was already committed elsewhere. It moved a little after 2 in the afternoon, and it did not arrive. Near Cam Vu, west of the break, it came up against a blocking position that had been placed there and was waiting. The fight ran from 4 in the afternoon until nearly midnight. The task force went back to the ground it had started from, with 4 of its tanks damaged. That evening, the division reached for what was left. A rifle company was lifted by helicopter out of the sector north of the river and put down at a bridge on the road above Dong Ha. A battalion was flown in from an area of operations in the west to a fire base on the same road. Both moves were made for the road. Both were made away from the water. By the last night of April, the division's reserve was back on its start line 20 kilometers to the west with 4 tanks out of action. 1 landing battalion was a rifle company short, and the regiment responsible for the ground north of the river had spent a day failing to close on a broken culvert. East of the road it was quiet. In the hamlets inside that quiet, 4 battalions sat under several feet of earth. At 3:30 in the morning on the 30th of April, a Navy patrol boat was working its way up the Dieu. Fire came at it from the northern bank, small arms and machine guns. It came out of An Loc, a hamlet that stood above the water. The boat answered, then turned back downstream for the ramp at Dong Ha. Half an hour later, the same position opened on a Navy utility boat. This time there were rocket grenades as well. The craft took several hits and turned back too. Everything north of Dong Ha ate and fired what came up that water. No Marine had yet set foot on the ground the fire came from. Lieutenant Colonel William Weiss heard the second report himself. He kept the Navy radio net running out of habit, and he was listening when the utility boat was hit. A patrol from Hotel Company had watched the same thing from the bank, out near Bok Vong, and called it in. He passed it up to Colonel Hull at the regiment. Then there were 2 hours of nothing. The order came with the light about 6. Find out what happened. The hamlet that had done the firing stood in a South Vietnamese regiment sector. To cross into it, the boundary had to be moved, and that took a decision at division. Dai Do was not a village, but 5 of them. On a small peninsula the water had cut out. Dong Huan lay at the northeastern lip. An Loc was 500 meters south of it, above the river, and Dai Do another 500 northwest. Rice paddies ran between them, and 2 cemeteries. What Weisi had to do it with was spread across 10 kilometers of country. His command post was at Mai Sa Chan, with 2 platoons of Foxtrot. A 3rd platoon sat east at Mai Loc, Gulf 3 kilometers north. Echo had been taken from him the day before and put out on the road west under the division. That left 2 units he could move. At 7, the boundary was shifted. The platoon near Bok Vong was told to cross the stream and look at the ground the fire had come from. The rest of Hotel was to come in off its patrols. Captain Butler put his 2 platoons of Foxtrot on amphibian tractors and started them toward Bak Vong. Marines in that battalion rode on top of the tractors rather than inside. The gasoline tank sat under the troop compartment. If a tractor went over a mine, there would be little chance of getting out. There were a great many mines in that country. About 8:30, the lead platoon came through Bok Vong to the stream that had been the boundary. Everything open together: rifles, machine guns, mortars, rockets. The North Vietnamese were dug in at Dong Huan on the far bank. It was plain at once that a platoon was not going to move them. At 9, the battalion commander went aboard a Navy monitor with his sergeant major, his air officer, and 3 radio operators. The monitor was an armored landing craft with a mortar in the well of it and cannon along the rails. It had radios enough to work with. The boat lay off Dong Huan, and the day was commanded from the water. The plan written from there was an ordinary one, made for a single afternoon. Hotel would cross the stream. The tanks, the reconnaissance platoon, and Foxtrot's tractors would fire from the near bank. Then Hotel would take Dong Huan, and Foxtrot would go on to Dai Do. 2 villages before dark. For a while it went as written. An airborne observer put gunships, airstrikes, and artillery across the whole complex and reported 3 heavy machine gun positions destroyed. Hotel crossed the stream and turned south through open paddy. The last 1,500 meters the company crawled, under smoke and white phosphorus laid by the guns. Foxtrot came over on the tractors behind it and took the right flank. At 2 in the afternoon, both companies went in. Hotel at Dong Huan, Foxtrot at Dai Do, 700 meters west. Hotel's fight was short, and it was not cheap. The company got in among the hedgerows and worked through. Halfway across, Captain Williams was hit. First Lieutenant Prescott took the company and carried the attack on. By 3 o'clock, the Marines held Dong Huan. It was the first of them. Foxtrot did not get its village. Artillery came down from the north. Mortars and machine guns fired out of Dai Do itself, and recoilless fire knocked out 2 of the tractors. The Marines had bolted 2 of their own recoilless guns to the roofs of 2 more, packed in place with sandbags. Even those could not put the fire down. 1 platoon reached the eastern edge of the hamlet and went to ground there. The other stopped where it was, in the open, on one of the cemeteries 300 meters short. Sometime that afternoon, Butler came up on the radio and reported 26 effective Marines. The number was wrong, and it took the dark to show it. Pulling the company together that night, he found about twice the men he had counted. Foxtrot had been spread across a paddy and a graveyard in 1s and 2s, out of sight of its own commander. golf never arrived. The company was standing by to be flown south. The first helicopters lifted out the mortar section, and then artillery came down on the zone with infantry behind it. Captain Vargas canceled the rest of the lift and beat off the attack. He walked his company out that night, coming in at 11:30. Colonel Hull went up the river in the afternoon to look for himself. He went in a 14-foot fiberglass boat with an outboard motor, the kind the Marines called a skimmer. He stopped at Dong Huan, then came aboard the Monitor. The battle was joined, he said, and the pressure had to be kept up. What he had to give was one company, Bravo, borrowed from another battalion. Vice sent it at An Loc, the hamlet that had fired on the boats before dawn. At 25 minutes past 4, the first wave landed under covering fire from the riverboats. The second was on the bank by 10 past 5. Fire met them from inside An Loc, from Dai Do to the north, and from Dong Lai across the western stream. Recoilless guns worked over the tractors, disabling one and destroying another. The company pushed into about half of the hamlet and stopped there. Lieutenant Norris was killed, and one officer was left in Bravo. An hour before dark, Weiss told the company to halt, reorganize, and hold the western half of An Loc. 3 perimeters in the dark where more than one battalion could tie together by radio and fire. Foxtrot was told to collect itself outside Dai Do and fall back into Dong Huan. Bravo and Hotel covered it in. That left 2 perimeters instead of 3, Dong Huan in the north and An Loc in the south. The North Vietnamese probed Dong Huan several times in the night and were pushed off each time. At the division command post that evening, General Tompkins gave his artillery officer an order. Every tube within range of Dai Do was to shift its trail until it pointed at the hamlet, and fire at the maximum sustained rate until morning. The village nobody had taken lay under that fire until it got light. From the air, a hamlet in that country showed as a set of small squares on the paddy, dark green, each one outlined by a hedge of bamboo. From the ground at 50 meters, it was a wall. The bamboo grew close and it grew tall. A man standing outside a hedgerow could not see 3 steps into it. The hedges had grown there long before the war and were not planted for it. What the North Vietnamese did was make them the frame of a position, and it did not take them long. Under a hedgerow they ran a tunnel, and the mat of roots overhead served for a roof. At ground level they cut firing slots through the growth for rifles, machine guns, and rocket launchers, then dressed the slots over so that they did not show. Inside the squares were bunkers built as A-frames. They were roofed with several feet of earth over bamboo legs and camouflaged until they read as ground. Trenches and fighting holes ran between them. There was barbed wire. The positions supported one another, each able to fire across the front of the next, and the ground before them had been cleared for it. They were built heavy. A roof of that kind would take the weight of a tank driven over it without giving. Mortars were set up inside the houses and the outbuildings, in pigsties and under haystacks, and fired from where they stood. What showed from outside the hedge was a village. The whole of it was joined underneath. A garrison threatened on one side could move through the tunnels to that side, fire from the slots, and go back. No part of it had to come into the open to do that. Marines coming across a paddy saw a hedgerow and took fire from a hedgerow. There was very little else to look at. Most of the digging had been done by the people who lived there. A few North Vietnamese officers laid out where the positions would go. It had all been marked in advance, so the units arriving from the north had only to walk in and man what was ready. The hamlets were lived-in villages, and this was what had been made of them. A Marine battalion that had worked this ground earlier had drawn the plain conclusion and written it down. Assume every village is built this way. Go at it with enough strength to finish the job quickly. The day before, this battalion had gone at one with a platoon, and then with 2 companies. It had taken the first village and not the second. Just before daybreak on the 1st of May, a patrol from Bravo Company felt its way out through An Loc. The North Vietnamese had left it in the night. Weiss came ashore in the skimmer, and on his order the company took over the rest of the hamlet. An Loc stood above the Dieu and looked down on the water, which was why the boats had been fired on from it. The second village of the chain cost nothing at all. By that morning the battalion held 2 of the 5 hamlets. Foxtrot and Hotel were in Dong Huan in a single perimeter. Bravo was in An Loc. Golf was back at Mai Sa Chan, where its night march had ended, and Echo was still out on the road to the west, under the division. Dai Do lay in front of all of them. At First Light Hotel, up in Dong Huan, saw about 60 enemy soldiers crossing an open paddy. They were west of Dai Do and north of An Loc. 2 company perimeters had them in view at once. The Marines fired with their own rifles and machine guns and called down the supporting arms on top of that. What that group had been, nobody ever established. Weiss thought later that it might have been a unit coming in to reinforce the hamlet and casting about for it in the dark. It might equally have been men who had slipped out of An Loc in the night and lost their way. He offered both and settled on neither. After that, the morning went quiet, in the way ground goes quiet while the guns are still working. The lull was almost entirely artillery falling on Dai Do. The hamlet had been under fire since the night before, when every tube in range was turned on it. Both sides spent the hours the same way, bringing men forward. At 9, an army battalion came in by helicopter to a zone north of Dong Ha. It did not come to Dai Do. Later in the day it went north instead, to the ground Golf had walked out of. The battalion in front of the hamlet saw nothing more of it. Golf's own move had been planned as a night landing at An Loc and an attack on Dai Do before dawn. The Navy landing craft that were to bring the company down from Mai Sa Chan were not available. None of that happened. The company waited where it was until about 8:30, then boarded 2 of them with the battalion's 2 tanks. This was a company that had canceled a helicopter lift under shell fire the day before and walked in through the dark. Now it went to the battle by river, because overland it did not go. The stream on the western side of the hamlets ran better than 5 feet deep, and it ran fast. Men carrying loads did not ford it. Water was the road. Weiss met the company on the water. He came out in the skimmer, intercepted the craft in midstream, and climbed aboard the leading one. He briefed Vargas as they went down. The plan had changed overnight. Golf would land at An Loc, pass through Bravo's lines and take Dai Do. Bravo would stay in reserve, and Foxtrot and Hotel would fire from Dong Huan. That was 4 companies and 3 hamlets. One of them would take a village by walking through a company that held a village taken the day before by a company borrowed from another battalion. 2 more would fire across at it from a third. The battalion was working with what it had within reach, and all of it lay within a kilometer. About 10, the company came ashore at An Loc with its tanks. To keep the sound of them from carrying, the amphibian tractors sitting with Bravo ran their engines up and made false starts along the bank, one after another, for as long as it took. A dozen diesels working on a riverbank covered too. Artillery and naval gunfire went on to Dai Do. As the artillery lifted, 2 Marine jets came in low over the hamlet with bombs and napalm. The day before, the battalion had asked for heavier guns and heavier bombs, and had not been given them. This morning it had the priority. What was asked for came, though the battalion commander said afterwards that it was neither as much nor as quick as he had wanted. Gulf formed to cross on the eastern flank of Bravo. 2 assault platoons with the tanks between them. Smoke and white phosphorus went down in front. The ground ahead was flat and it was open, and nothing stood on it that a man could get behind. Between the last hedge of An Loc and the first hedge of Dai Do lay 500 meters of rice paddy. Between An Loc and Dai Do, the ground opens out and stays open for 500 meters. It is rice paddy, flooded and worked, cut into panels by low earth dikes that a man can lie behind and not much more. Nothing standing on it is higher than the grass. At the far side the ground lifts a little, and the hedgerows begin. The water in the panel stands above the knee in the low corners, and shallower where the ground rises toward the dikes. Under the water is worked mud, soft to the shin, and it holds a boot on the way up. Walking in it is not walking. A man pulls one leg clear, sets it down, and pulls the other, and it is the pulling that costs him, not the distance. On flat ground the graves matter. The burial mounds rose a meter or so above the water, rounded and packed hard, and out in those fields, they were the only thing that stopped anything. A platoon that could not go forward would stop at one and stay. The dikes between the panels stand a hand or two high, and their tops bake dry in the sun until they take a boot print like a path. That is the top centimeter of them. Under the crust is the same mud as everywhere else, and any weight put down goes through it and finds the water. What reads from a distance as a network of dry lanes across the field is not one. Every man carried the day on him. Rifle and ammunition, grenades, water for however long it took, and among them the demolition charges and the one-shot rockets that men slung across their backs, 3 at a time, on a road that is a load a man walks under. In water to the knee, it is the reason he cannot run more than a few strides before he has to stop running and go back to waiting. By 10 in the morning there was no shade anywhere on that ground. The water took the sun and gave it back off the surface. The mud held it, and what smoke there was lay flat and did not move. Nothing across 500 meters of paddy threw a shadow big enough for a man to stand in. The far hedge threw one, and the far hedge was the objective. The amphibian tractors came off the same river. They were lightly armored boxes that swam, climbed out, and drove, and could put a company anywhere along the water within minutes. Marines rode on the roofs rather than inside. The fuel tank sat beneath the troop compartment. The area was thick with mines, and the men had long since decided which of the 2 places was better. On the roofs, they stacked sandbags and rode behind them. Smoke and white phosphorus went down across the far side before anything moved. Phosphorus burns white and hangs a long time in still air, and a line of it laid along a hedgerow reads from half a kilometer as a low wall the color of dirty milk. It does not hide the field. It hides what is standing on the other side of the field, which is the half that matters. Out past the eastern flank of the reserve the company went, the tanks between its 2 assault platoons, and the two lines stepped down off the last dry ground into the panels. The first men in went to the knee and kept going, and the ones behind them went in where they went in. A field like that does not sound the way it looks. There is very little shouting on it. There is water breaking under a company's boots, out of step and never together, and there is breathing, and there is the flat knock of equipment against equipment at every stride. Above all of it sits the noise of the guns working the hedge in front, which belongs to somebody else and has nothing to do with the running. 500 meters is nothing on a road. A few minutes at a walk, less at a jog. Through flooded panels under a load it takes several times that, and the extra cannot be bought back by wanting it back. The pace is set by the mud, and the mud is the same whether the field is quiet or not. What a man could see going across was not a village. It was a line of bamboo the height of a house, gray-green behind the smoke, and it did not appear to come any closer. The dikes went by underfoot at a rate that could be counted, and the hedge stayed where it was. That is the ordinary trick of flat open ground, and it works on people who know about it. Going down was not the answer it looks like from outside. A man who dropped in a panel dropped into water. The dike stood a hand or two above the surface, so what a man got behind one was cover for as much of himself as he could press below the crest. And he got it lying in the paddy. Standing up out of that took longer than never having gone down. The two tanks kept the middle. From beside one, a tank on that ground is not shelter. It is the largest thing on the field. It moves at the speed the field allows, and no faster, and the engine on it is loud enough to be the only thing a man walking alongside can hear. The platoon stayed off it far enough not to share what it drew, and close enough to keep it. Mortars and automatic weapons opened from the hedge and stopped the left flank 200 meters short of it. The rest of the company kept going, came up out of the water onto the rising ground, and reached the first line of bunkers. What the crossing bought was contact with the near edge of a position. Inside, the fight came down to a few meters at a time. Bunkers were opened with satchel charges and grenades, one and then the next, in ground where a position stayed invisible until it fired. Some were left behind rather than cleared. By 2, the company stood on the northern edge of the village. The counterattack came from the north and the west, about a battalion of it. Artillery carried as much of it as the infantry did. Heavy guns beyond the demilitarized zone, adjusted with the precision the Marines remarked on, and mortars closer in. Then the positions passed by in the southwest opened fire from behind. A village crossed is not a village taken. Orders came to fall back into the eastern end of Dai Do and hold there. By 5, the company had a perimeter and 3 things to wait for: ammunition, more men, and the next attack. From inside it reported troops massing around Thuong Do, 3 kilometers northeast. An airborne observer found the same movement and an artillery spotting party with it, and both were struck from the air. Getting anything through took the rest of the day. A company attacked out of Dong Huan and was stopped well short. The radios were jammed. The battalion changed frequencies and went on calling fire. At about 5, the borrowed company mounted the tractor decks and drove at the same 500 meters. The fire that met it stopped it where it stood, and after dark, it was brought back into onlock. Golf spent the night in the northeastern corner of Dai Do, in a perimeter small enough to walk around in a couple of minutes. Aircraft dropped flares over it and kept dropping them. So the hedgerows stood white and flat, went black, and stood again. The North Vietnamese came at it several times before morning and were pushed off. Behind it, the battalion held Dong Huan and An Loc. Between them, the field that had been crossed at 10 in the morning lay empty under the flares. 500 meters of water and mud, the dike showing dark across it, the light swinging slowly as it came down. Golf Company began this fight 8 kilometers away from it. It was holding ground on both sides of Jones Creek, up near Nhi Ha and Lam Xuan, 3,000 meters north of the battalion command post, which itself sat well back from the hamlets on the peninsula. Between the company and the fighting lay a night's walk. A rifle company is 3 rifle platoons, a weapon section, and whatever it can carry between them. This one no longer had its own medium mortars. They had gone south ahead of the men on the first aircraft out, and the men did not follow them. From that point, the heaviest thing the company owned was what a man could put on his shoulder, and everything above that had to be asked for from somebody else and waited on. Then it walked. The march went south in the dark, under shell fire from guns beyond the demilitarized zone for part of the way, and the company came into Mai Sa Chan at 11:30 at night, without the mortars it had started with. The men who would cross 500 meters of open paddy in the morning arrived with that behind them and what was left of the night ahead. Morning came, and for a long time nothing came with it. The company sat by the water with its gear on, told to be ready, and then told to hold, which is most of what a rifle company does on most days of a war. Some kilometers off, in the direction it was going to go, the guns could be heard working steadily on something. What they were working on was the objective. A company at that hour knows a hamlet name and a direction. It does not know how many are in the hamlet, or what has been built into the hedgerow around it, or how long any of it has been there. Men who have been in a place for 2 days know those things. Men who arrive that morning know what they can see from where they are standing, which was a river, a far bank, and smoke over it. It came ashore in the middle of the morning and made itself into the shape it needed. 2 platoons up spread along the inside of a hedge that belonged to another company. 1 platoon back, the sections told off left and right and the intervals paced out. A company crosses open ground in a form somebody drew for it beforehand. Getting into that form took longer than the crossing did. The 2 tanks were the battalions, and the battalion had 2. They went across with the company, and both of them came out of the field damaged and were sent to the rear. And after that, nobody in Dai Do had armor. One of the company's officers said afterward that they could have used 10. From then on, the company had what it carried: rifles, machine guns, grenades, satchel charges, and the light rockets men slung 3 at a time across their backs. Inside a hedgerow, a company stops looking like one. The bamboo closed behind the first men through it, and after that a platoon could not see the platoon beside it, and often could not see its own far squad. The work was done by 4s and 5s, at a bunker each, because that was the size of group that could get to a bunker. The company commander could see as far as the next stand of bamboo, which is to say, a few meters. The company commander put that afternoon in 2 numbers. He had started with 123 men, he said, and by the time he got through the village he was down to 41. The rest were behind him, stopped out on the paddy, held up in the parts of the hamlet that had been passed by, spread across ground that took a long time to cross. Every man who came out the far side was carrying a captured rifle. Those 2 numbers are the ends of a line, and the line ran all day. The company that stepped off at 10 was not the company that reached the first bunkers, and neither was the one that stood at the north end at 2 in the afternoon, or the one that dug in at the eastern corner at 5. Its strength changed by the hour, and nobody counted it by the hour. 2 numbers is all its commander ever put on it, and he put them on afterward. What the company did not know that afternoon would have filled the day. It did not know that the bunkers left behind in the southwestern corner were still manned and would fire into its back. It did not know the size of what was forming north and west of the hamlet. A kilometer away, another company was being stopped in the open, and the men in the hedgerow learned that when somebody said it on the radio. The battalion had a map. The company had a hedge. The commander was wounded somewhere in the middle of all this and did not hand the company over. There was no arrangement standing by if he had. His executive officer and his platoon commanders each had part of a company to hold together in ground where nobody could see anybody. He kept it because there was nowhere to pass it to. The perimeter it fell back into was a corner of a hamlet, and from inside it did not look like a position. It looked like fighting holes scratched into the base of a hedge, arcs of fire told off by pointing, and beyond the bamboo, 3 paces away, ground that nobody had walked on and nobody could see. Men in a hole knew the 2 men in the hole to either side of them. Anything passed that they took on the radio. Ammunition was counted by hand and moved by hand from the men who had some to the men who had none, and it was still short, and the resupply that had been asked for did not come across the field that day. The captured rifles in the holes were not a souvenir by evening. A company that has run its own belts down and is holding a corner of somebody else's village fires what is lying in the village. The rest of it arrived as sound. Late in the day, the net carried another company setting out to reach them, and then carried it being stopped in the open, and then its commander going down, and then a voice that had never had a company before trying to take one over in the middle of a paddy. The men in Dai Do could not see any of that. They could hear all of it. The man who talked to him was the commander of the company inside Dai Do. He was wounded. He was in a perimeter he had fallen back into, with 41 men who had come through the village, under attack from 2 sides, waiting for a resupply that had not arrived. He kept talking, unhurried, until the officer on the other end had hold of his company again. By dark, Golf was the only company of the battalion inside the hamlet, and the ground between it and the rest of them was the same ground it had crossed at 10 that morning. It held its corner, kept its arcs, passed ammunition along the hedge, and waited on the sound of its own people coming across the field from the south. Dai Do was in Marine hands by 9:30 on the morning of the 2nd of May. The 2 companies that had gone in before daylight stood and turned earth and cut hedgerow, and north of them, past a low run of paddy, lay the 2 hamlets nobody had reached. Dinh To first, then Thuong Do behind it, side by side at the far end of the ground. Half an hour earlier, the regimental commander had come forward to the battalion's command post in An Loc. Colonel Hull was satisfied with the morning, and he told the battalion commander to keep the pressure on the enemy. The answer he got was that the battalion was very nearly spent, down to what could hold ground and not much more. What Weiss proposed instead was to bring in the units that were not tired. Anvil and Hammer, the battalions to the north attacking south. The enemy squeezed between them and the Marines in Dai Do. Hull had almost nothing to give. He could try for the South Vietnamese regiment that owned the sector to cover the west flank, and around noon he came back with a mechanized battalion. The western stream became the boundary. Everything across it belonged to the South Vietnamese, who would take the hamlets on that side. Everything north of Dai Do belonged to the Marines, who would attack into Dinh To and Thuong Do. The stream was not a line on a map. It ran about 5.5 feet deep and moved fast enough that a loaded man could not walk it. Dinh To was built like the others, and by now, the battalion knew what that meant. So a third of it was not a third of the ground. It was a third of a system that went on working under the hedgerow on either side. Rice paddies lay between the hamlets and 2 cemeteries, so the low grave mounds were terrain the way the dikes were, something to lie behind and to be shot from. Hotel company was given the village. Its captain had been wounded in an earlier hamlet, and a first lieutenant had held it since. Leaving the line of departure about 1 o'clock, the company came through the lines in Dai Do and fought its way into about a third of Dinh To before the ground stopped giving. At that point, the enemy counterattacked. The company kept its positions, but Lieutenant Prescott called over the radio for help, telling the battalion he did not expect to survive the next attack as a company. From Dai Do, Captain Livingston did not wait for an order. He collected what was left of Echo, about 30 men, and brought them up into Dinh To. Prescott was badly hit soon after, and Hotel Company passed to Second Lieutenant Bayard Taylor, the Corps' most junior officer rank. 3 commanders for 1 company inside 3 days. It was the arithmetic of doing the same work 6 times with what the last time left. Taylor described what came next in plain terms. The volume of it dwarfed everything the company had been through before. He remembered banana trees going down under automatic fire, the masonry wall of a hut cut away the same way, and the brush in front of the position looking alive with men who had covered themselves in it. The 2 companies worked up a run of trenches until a machine gun stopped them, and another attack came in behind it. Early in the afternoon, the order went out to break contact, and under air and artillery, they pulled back to Dai Do. Half the day was gone and the hamlet stood as it had at 1 o'clock. Word had come that the mechanized battalion held Dong Lai, 500 meters west of Dai Do on the other bank. With Hull's approval, Weiss worked out the second attempt, 2 attacks in echelon, 1 on each side of the stream. The Marines going into Dinh To again while the South Vietnamese pushed northwest. He had no officer to spare as a liaison, so the arrangement rested on radio. Weiss and his operations officer, Major Warren, spoke to the American advisor with the South Vietnamese battalion, and the advisor told them its commander understood the plan and agreed to it. That conversation was the whole of the link between the 2 halves of the attack. The companies chosen were Golf and Foxtrot. Golf was down to about 40 men. It still had 4 officers, which tells you what had happened to it rather than to them. Foxtrot had a platoon brought in from My Lock and stood at around 80. Vargas would lead with Golf, Foxtrot following and passing through wherever Golf was stopped. Weiss went forward with a small command group. Major Warren took the perimeter the other 2 companies held behind them. A little over 100 men were going north into 2 hamlets. The ground between them was the same ground as everywhere else here. A few hundred meters of paddy, cut into panels, with the dikes running across it at the height of a curb. Then a hedge, and behind the hedge whatever had been dug there. It was short enough to see all at once, which is no advantage when the far side sees all of you. It was the 3rd time in 2 days that men from this battalion had crossed open ground toward a hedgerow here. And the second that day, they knew by now how long it took and what would meet them. That knowledge is worth something, and it is not worth much. At 4 o'clock, under air and artillery, both companies stepped off. Golf Company met only scattered rifle fire moving through Dinh To, through the same trenches and hedgerows that had held the battalion since 1 that afternoon. Foxtrot Company never got that far. It bogged down in the paddies east of the hamlet under artillery and heavy automatic fire from the northeast. Not knowing that, Golf Company kept going and reached the southern edge of Thuong Do. 40 men on the 5th village, the northernmost point the battalion reached in the fight. Fire came at them from the front and from the right. Weiss ordered the company to halt and let Foxtrot Company come up, and only then learned that it was not behind him. About 5 o'clock, automatic fire began arriving from the left and the left rear, out of the ground across the stream that the mechanized battalion was supposed to hold. They could see a large number of men over there. For 10 or 15 minutes the Marines looked at them and took them for the Allied unit, and what told them otherwise was an absence, no carriers. The lead companies were now in unprotected perimeters with enemy troops in between them, and the battalion called its own supporting fire in, around itself and on top of itself. Sergeant Major John Molnar was killed by a rocket-propelled grenade. Weiss was seriously wounded, and Major Warren, back in Dai Do, took the battalion. Golf Company stopped the attack in front of it, then turned and dealt with what was coming from behind. The withdrawal was made by fire teams, each covering the next, back through the paddy to where Foxtrot Company was pinned. Both companies came back into Dinh To, where Warren met them with a platoon assembled out of whoever was at hand, and amphibian tractors up at the edge of the hamlet. By 6 in the evening the perimeter was closed again in Dai Do. On the ground the battalion had taken that morning, with replacements and some reorganizing. Each company came to 40 men and 1 officer. That night Major Charles Knapp took the battalion from Warren, so that in one day it had been commanded by 3 men and hotel company by 2. Knapp came from the rear command post, which was not on this shore at all. It stood aboard a helicopter carrier off the coast, because this was an amphibious battalion, and the ship was where its rear belonged. The hamlets had been entered twice and held neither time, and the men were back inside the hedgerow they started from. The counterattack in Dinh To found echo in a place with nowhere to stand. There was a hedgerow behind them and a run of trenches ahead, and about 30 men of Echo Company were in it alongside what was left of Hotel Company. They had come up out of Dai Do an hour before. The ground gave them nothing to get behind that the defenders had not already dug and registered. Sergeant James Rogers, who had a platoon of Echo that day, put it flatly afterward. They were taking a great deal of machine gun fire, and the brush in front of them kept refilling. 1 man down and another in the same place. He gave the credit for the company not coming apart to its captain, who turned up wherever the line was worst. Echo was the company that had not been there. When the battalion first went into these hamlets, Echo Company was not under its command at all. It was on the highway north of Dong Ha, about 5,000 meters west of the sector, holding a bridge for the division, and it stayed there while the other companies worked through the first villages. What it had of the battle was the radio. Weiss came back to that afterward more than once. His force had gone in piecemeal, a company at a time as each one was released to him, and he said later that he felt an hour late and a dime short throughout. The company that would carry the next morning spent the opening of the battle standing on a bridge in another sector. Getting it back took most of a day, and then the stream was in the way. The water ran about 5.5 feet deep and came down fast, near enough to unfordable that a loaded man had no business in it. Livingston solved it by having 6 of his tallest men strip down and plant themselves in the deepest part of the water, and pass the shorter, heavily loaded Marines hand to hand across to the shallows. The company reached en loc in the evening, and the first thing it did on this ground was not an attack. In the dark, Livingston and Lieutenant Mutter, who had the battalion's reconnaissance platoon, led a number of small parties out across the paddies that were being swept by fire, and brought another company back in from where it had been fighting all afternoon. That same night, one of Echo's squads went out and stayed out. Rogers took his men beyond the perimeter and set them at a grave mound 75 to 100 meters in front of the company, with orders to hold the position until it got light. The mound was cover and a landmark at once. There was nothing to do out there but lie still and listen. Just before first light, they heard voices ahead of them. Rogers called the captain on the radio and was told there was no friendly patrol out in that direction. He thought they might be men wanting to come over to the government side, and he called out to them in Vietnamese, asking if they were Chiu Hoi. The answer was fire. The squad answered with rifles and a machine gun, and when it was over, they came back inside the lines for the attack. The attack had been worked out during the night by a battalion commander who did not sleep. A prisoner had told his interrogators that there were no fewer than 12 companies in Dai Do, and Weisa was not certain the company already in the village could hold it. He decided to go in before dawn. Echo attacking northwest out of en loc to join Golf Company inside Dai Do, and the two of them clearing the place together. So the company that had arrived last the evening before was given the morning. At 5 o'clock it left the line of departure and moved for its attack position south of the village, across the open paddy, 500 meters of it, flat and wet, with the hedgerow line ahead. Heavy fire made 2 of the platoons hesitate. Livingston took his reserve platoon forward himself to get the movement started again. Then it was hours of close work along the hedgerows. The bunkers were opened with flamethrowers, white phosphorus, grenades, satchel charges, and the one-shot rocket tube a man carries strapped to his back. The recommendation written up afterward counts more than 100 bunkers in Dai Do, supporting one another, which is the only count of them anywhere in the record. Rogers described what they were working against in a few words. In fortified positions and bunkers, and not moving, nothing maneuvered. The defense stayed where it had been built, and made the attackers come to each part of it in turn. Livingston was hit by grenade fragments somewhere in that and went on with the company. By about 9:30, the 2 companies had Dai Do. By midday, the company was down to roughly 30 men, and it was in Dai Do resting on ground it had taken 4 hours earlier. Then the call came from Dinh To, where Hotel Company had gone in and stopped. Livingston did not wait for an order. He collected what he had and started north, and the word went along Hotel Company's line ahead of him that Echo was coming, and the men there passed it to one another. Between one evening and the next afternoon, that company had crossed a stream it could not wade, gone out into the paddies in the dark to bring another unit in, held a position at a grave mound until dawn, crossed 500 meters of open water at 5 in the morning, and finished a village by 9:30. What was left of it was now in the next village up the line. For a time both companies rallied and seemed to have the upper hand, and it did not last. They got as far as the machine gun and no farther, and after the machine gun came the attack that Rogers remembered. 2 companies, neither of them a company by then, stood in a third of a hamlet they could not finish taking. At 2:30 the order came to break contact and come back. Livingston by then could not walk, and he would not be taken back before the rest of his men. Under air and artillery, both companies pulled out of Dinh To to Dai Do, and they came back with all of their own. The recommendation written for him afterward sets down the shape of it without any of this detail. The assault across 500 meters of open paddy, the village that had been seized the evening before. The 3rd company that went on into Dinh To and was stopped by a counterattack of an enemy battalion, and a company commander wounded 3 times who stayed in the exposed ground and put his men into better positions. Both of the men who told this day from inside it lived a long time with it. Livingston finished his service as a major general, and when the official history of that year was drafted, he was one of the officers who read the manuscript and sent in comments. Rogers, a master gunnery sergeant by then, read the same draft and wrote his night at the grave mound into it, 26 years after he lay behind it. 10 kilometers northeast of Dong Ha, the ground changes. The paddies thin out and give way to sand, to dunes and bare soil, running several thousand meters inland from the sea. Through that sand a stream comes down out of the demilitarized zone and empties into the Cua Viet. On the maps it carried no name at all. The Marines called it Jones Creek, and the name stuck to everything along it. Close to the water the sand gave way again to a narrow band of paddy. The growers lived in hamlets on the banks, and by that spring many of them stood empty. The one that mattered here was Nhi Ha, and the histories describe it as ruined already. Not a village anymore, but earthworks where a village had been. 1,000 meters to the northwest lay Lam Swan, and across the water lay Lam Swan again, one name given to 2 hamlets facing each other. So the Americans wrote them down as east and west and told them apart by the bank. The creek ran between them, brown and narrow, paddy dikes coming down to it on both sides. Why anyone wanted this place was written 3 times by 3 services. The Marine Battalion commander to the south called Nhi Ha a staging area for movement down the creek. The Army history calls it a waypoint used whenever the regiment came toward the shipping in the river below. An Air Force report says sappers used the waterway as a matter of routine to reach the Cua Viet and cut the traffic that fed Dong Ha. So the stake here was the stake everywhere else in the province. Not the hamlet, but the water at the far end of it. A stream nobody had named was a way down to the one road that fed the whole north. Without setting foot on a road. The hamlets here had been taken before. In January, a Marine rifle company needed more than 5 hours to get clear of Lam Swan. 2 nights later, aircraft bombed the place by radar in the dark. The ships offshore worked it over after 8 in the morning, and the unit inside came through relatively unscathed. Armor did not settle it either. 3 tanks were disabled by mines coming up into their attack positions, and a 4th went nose down into a water-filled crater and stayed there. By then every hamlet on this creek had been entered and left 3 or 4 times over. What these places had and went on having was digging that fire could not reach. The battalion that came for it was an Army battalion borrowed. It had been in another province 2 weeks earlier, held in reserve for a corps that had lent out the units it usually leaned on. Nothing about it had been raised, trained, or moved with this creek in mind. and it arrived knowing nothing of the ground except that somebody needed it held. What made room for it was a departure. The marine company that had held both banks came out, and by the time it was clear, the whole of Jones Creek was open. The northern approaches to Dong Ha were uncovered, and there was almost nothing to put in the space. The other side knew where the seams were, and had known for a long time. The gap on the creek was not simply the accident of one unit leaving in the dark, and the Marine general had reason to believe, at the time of the fighting for Dai Do, that the attack here to the northeast and another to the southwest may have been the main effort of the division moving on the river. On that reading, the village complex where the Marines were spending themselves was the shoulder of the offensive, not its point. The Army battalion came up in a day. Helicopters took it from its base camp to a landing zone on the river, and it reached the hamlets the next morning. The histories disagree on whether that last stretch was flown or walked. Either way, it found both Lam Xuans nearly empty and moved on to Nhi Ha. Nhi Ha was not empty. There the North Vietnamese sprang one of their traps, and the fighting was close in and short-ranged. Who was in there depends on which volume is open. The Army history names a battalion of an independent regiment. The Marine volume elements of the division fighting at Dai Do. Both describe the same ground, bunkers sited to cover one another. By dark, the battalion was back across the creek in Lam Xuan West, calling supporting arms down on the hamlet it had walked into that morning. That first day set the pattern. Marine artillery softened the defenses and the battalion attacked. Around midday came the first of 3 counterattacks, and while it was throwing them off, the unit pulled back out of contact, so that Marine air could work the positions again. Falling back here was a tool, and it was used like one. Anti-aircraft guns took one of the Navy jets down over the hamlet, and its pilot was killed. The hamlet was not taken that day either. At dark, the battalion crossed back to the west bank, and the next day repeated the one before it. An attack a little after 9:30. Men enmeshed again in the same works. On the following morning, the attack went in mid-morning after what the volume calls the usual air and artillery bombardment. The word is the volume's own, and it is the honest word for those days. There was almost no resistance, and before noon the battalion reported the hamlet secured. A method like that spends days rather than hours. The battalion took ground each morning, held it through the afternoon under supporting arms, and went back across the creek before dark, and at first light the same ground was there to be taken again. Down at Dai Do the fighting was thinning out by then. Up the creek, nothing about the days had changed. It is worth saying plainly how different that is from what was happening 3 kilometers south. The Marines went at their hamlets by daylight, took what they could hold, and stayed on it through the night with whatever was left. The Army battalion took its hamlet, gave it back at dusk, and took it again in the morning. Neither was the right way and neither was the wrong one. 2 answers to the same question arrived at a few thousand meters and one boundary line apart. Neither answer was cheap, and not in the direction that seems obvious. Giving ground back each evening meant crossing it again each dawn, which is the most expensive thing infantry does. Holding it overnight meant being counterattacked in the dark by people who knew every trench in it. Some days later, one of the companies went out on a sweep to the northwest and was ambushed moving in column through tall brush. The rest of the battalion came up in time to keep it from being overrun and pulled it back under artillery. Not everyone came back with it. 2 men walked into the lines by themselves that evening. Later still, a company on the same ground saw movement before dawn, some 300 men coming toward its positions in the dark. It pulled in its night patrols, asked for continuous illumination, and put artillery on them. The answer came as guns from north of the zone, and then, at about 6, as an assault along the whole battalion front. Jets, gunships, artillery, and naval gunfire came in together, and by mid-afternoon it was over. After that, the division on the other side stopped working south toward the river and broke into small parties heading north. The Army battalion went back by air to Camp Evans, and from there to the valley and the operation it had left. The Marine General handed the Nhi Ha sector back to the 2nd Battalion of the 4th Marines, to the same people who had held the creek before any of this began. 1 man was still carried on the rolls as missing. Behind everything on this river stood the largest artillery regiment the Marine Corps had ever put together. By the end of the previous year, it counted about 180 pieces of mixed caliber, from the heavy self-propelled guns down to the mortars, spread through positions that ran from the coast at Dong Ha westward into the mountains and south along the road. Not all of it was Marine. Army heavy guns and Army howitzers worked to the regiment, with an Army headquarters to administer them, and a Marine on a radio calling Army guns was nothing worth remarking on. The colonel who ran it said of himself that his whole service had been in supporting arms. The heaviest of those guns threw a shell more than 30 kilometers. All of the fighting on this river fitted inside 5 kilometers of paddy and sand. 1/6 of that reach, and less than that for most of the pieces. Nothing was ever out of range, and range was never the problem. What mattered was whether anyone could say where to put it. Guns wear out from the inside. A crane would come up to a battery, lift a used barrel off its mount, and set a new one in place, the way a shop changes an engine. When one battery fired its 200,000th round in this country, the regimental commander came out and pulled the lanyard himself. It was ordered through one room. At each headquarters, a fire support coordination center sat over everything that could shoot, and that spring the division added an information center inside it, meant to work out better firing data and keep the target list current from what had been seen before. The computing was done on punched cards, and the memory was small, and the volume records the limit without embarrassment. Nothing could really be retrieved in real time. So the list aged. What was seen in the afternoon was fired on in the morning, by which time whatever had been there had walked away. The Air Force was persuaded to send men to sit in that room. When aircraft were working inside artillery range, the guns had to hold their fire, and every restriction was time somebody did not have. Shells and aircraft shared one piece of sky, and the sharing went better with both services at one table. At the far end of the machinery was one man in a light aircraft. The battalion kept radio links to an aerial observer, and through him, it put gunships, strikes, and artillery onto positions the men below could not see. What the ground asked for went up to him first and came back down as fire. Not all of the fire was meant to destroy. Batteries fired white phosphorus and smoke to cloak a company crossing open ground. A wall the color of dirty milk laid between men in the hedgerow watching them. Smoke of that kind is a strange thing to rely on. It hides you, and it hides what you are walking toward, and it drifts. So the wall that stood between a company and a tree line at 1 minute has moved off the line by the next. Men crossing behind it are working to a clock they cannot see. From the sea came the rest of it. Cruisers and destroyers of the 7th Fleet worked this coast, and in the first half of 1968 they fired more in support of the shore than in the whole of the year before. A ship also does something a howitzer cannot. It can close a direction. In one fight on the creeks north of here, a company breaking contact pushed what was in front of it into the belt. The naval guns covered. Aircraft came through a control station that usually sat beside the coordination center of the unit it served, and one of the divisions too stood at the forward headquarters at Dong Ha, on the same ground as the bridge and the crossroads. Radar teams worked there as well, on a set good for 50 miles. Strike aircraft carried beacons the radar could follow, so a crew could fly in cloud, take the count from a voice on the ground and drop without ever seeing what it dropped on. Getting a strike was another matter. Air support that was planned rather than scrambled wanted 36 hours of notice, and on this ground the situation changed inside an hour. Requests went up through the division air officer instead of straight to the station built to coordinate air. The battalion's own report notes that as the fighting went on, close air got easier to obtain. Weather explains why any of it flew. 4/5 of the year's rain falls here between September and January, under low cloud and drizzle that keeps aircraft on the ground for days together. By April, the sky opens. Everything over these hamlets was flown in the best air of the year, and everyone involved knew it would not last. The same season worked the other way as well. Summer rains in Laos drove traffic off the mountain trails, and infiltration shifted east, down through the zone and the sand and the paddy to the creeks. The weather that let the aircraft see these hamlets was the weather that had filled them. And with all of it, the fire often decided nothing. The positions were dispersed, camouflaged, roofed with earth and timber and sited to cover one another, and a shell bursting on the surface of a roof does little to what is underneath. What was wanted was a fuse that let the round go in first and burst inside. Both ends of the chain said so. The headquarters in Da Nang judged the guns hidden north of the river proof against anything short of heavy bombs with delayed fuses. The battalion commander at Dai Do said the same from below. He had asked for heavy air and for 8-inch missions, had not got them, and concluded that his unit did not have priority. The other side had its own artillery, reaching 27 kilometers from behind the river, far enough to touch every forward base in the province. Anti-aircraft batteries north of the zone were thick enough to spoil both the bombing and the observation artillery needs to correct itself. Take away the man in the light aircraft, and the guns fire blind. When nothing else answered, the answer was to drive up close and shoot flat. Tank cannon and recoilless rifles put a round through an aperture instead of onto a roof. The recoilless rifles rode on small tracked vehicles carrying 6 barrels and on the amphibian tractors, which laid a base of fire across the water while riflemen crossed. Tanks were few here, and mines were plentiful. At night, the heavy battery fired from its pits, and the flash lit the sand a moment at a time. In the morning, the crews stacked the casings, looked at the wear in the tubes, and waited on the radio for the next coordinates. By 6 in the evening on the 2nd of May, the battalion's perimeter stood in Dai Do again. It had gone north out of the hamlet in the afternoon, twice, and come back both times, and the ground it held at dark was the ground it had held at first light. The same hedgerows on the southern edge, the same dikes behind them, the same turned earth where the bunkers were. 3 men had commanded it in the course of that one day, and the third of them came ashore in the dark, from a ship offshore, where he had spent the whole fight listening to it arrive over the radio. Probes came against the lines inside the hamlet during the night. Small ones, the kind that find out where a position is rather than try to take it. Between them, the paddy was quiet enough to hear water moving in the ditches, and quiet enough to hear men shifting along the dikes. By first light, there was little sign of the enemy in front of the battalion at all. Aerial observers were up over the flat country soon after daybreak. They saw small groups of North Vietnamese moving north away from Thuong Do, and they called airstrikes down on them. Nobody on the ground made contact with anybody. That was the last of the fighting in this sector, and it was done from the air, at a distance, without a shot fired from the hamlets. Work of a different kind waited for the 3rd of May. The sector had to be handed to somebody else, and the battalion had men in the hamlets to the north that it had not brought back. Both things were done that day, in that order, and by nightfall the battalion was off the ground it had been fighting for since the last day of April. Later in the day, the sector passed to the 1st Battalion of the 3rd Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Jarmond. Its companies took over responsibility for Dai Do and the ground around it, the hamlet, the paddy south of it, the line of hedgerows that had been the front edge of everything for 3 days. They were a fresh battalion at full strength, and they came onto the position in daylight. Jarmond's battalion swept north through Dinh To and Thuong Do that afternoon. Those 2 hamlets had cost the 2nd Battalion of the 4th Marines 2 attacks and most of a day, and the fresh battalion went through both of them without incident. Nobody fired on the column. The trenches were there, and the hedgerows, and the bunkers dug in under the houses, and there was nobody in them. Golf company and hotel company followed in trace. They had been put under Jarmond's operational control for the day, and they came up behind the sweep, into ground the other battalion had just walked through, to bring back the Marines of the previous day's fighting who had not been brought back. The 2 companies that did it were the 2 that had held the hamlet. It was not given to anyone else. It took them the rest of the daylight. They worked north through Dinh To and into the edge of Thuong Do, and then back down the same line, and they finished at 7:35 in the evening and began to move out of the Dai Do area. Behind them, the fresh battalion was digging in for its first night on the position. Shortly after 9 o'clock, the last elements of the 2 companies came into Mai Sa Chan. It was the battalion's own old command post, the place it had gone out from, and nothing about it had changed in 4 days. The low ground by the water, the landing point on the bank, the mud that came up soft under boots, the smell of the river in the dark. The move back to the base area was made by water, the way they had come. Going out by water was the last ordinary thing about those 4 days. They had come down the river to get to this, and they went back up it when it was finished, on the same craft, past the same banks, with the same engines making the same noise. A man who had slept through the middle of it would have found the beginning and the end identical. The only thing that had changed was how many of them there were standing on the deck. 3 days is what the record calls it, the 3-day fight for the Dai Do complex. Counted from the 30th of April through the 2nd of May. The 3rd, the day of the sweep and the return, falls outside the count. On the 3rd, the battalion lost nobody. Over those 3 days, the battalion had 81 men killed and nearly 300 wounded. 81 is the figure every source gives, and gives the same. The wounded were never counted quite the same way twice, in the field, and afterward and by different headquarters. And nearly 300 is where the counts come together. For the other side, there were only estimates, and the men who made them said as much. Marine estimates of the number of enemy dead in the fight ran from nearly 500 to over 600. That was the range, not a figure, and the record prints it as a range. Weiss's own count was larger, and he built it from what other units around Dai Do had counted as well as from his own. 600 bodies in the immediate area of the battle, and another 500 to 600 in the extended battle area. Then he took it apart himself. Body count figures, he said, are always suspect, and his advice about his own was to cut them in half for inflation before anybody used them at all. So the numbers sit where they sit. They were made in different places, by different units, some counting ground they had walked over and some counting from above it, and the record keeps them apart rather than putting them together. Dai Do was where the heaviest fighting of those days happened, and it was not the only place the 320th Division had gone. 3 miles west, at Cam Phu, another Marine battalion had sporadic contact with scattered units of the same division across the same 3 days. A South Vietnamese regiment reported continuous action through the night of the 1st of May and took a hamlet west of Dai Do the next morning, all of it inside a few miles of ground. In Dai Do, the fresh battalion held the position through the night of the 3rd. Nothing came against it. The hamlets to the north, which had been the direction everything came from for 3 days, stayed dark and stayed quiet, and the men on the line listened to the same paddy without hearing anything move in it. By morning, the flat ground between the hamlets lay open and empty. Water stood in the paddies as it had stood all week, and the ruts the amphibian tractors had cut through the dikes were filling in with it, and the hedgerows ran on north the way they always had, and there was nothing to hear out of any of it. There was a short pause in the Dai Do area, and then the work moved on without the battalion that had done it. On the morning of the 5th of May, the fresh battalion attacked north out of Thuong Do, toward a village 1,200 meters to the northwest, with a South Vietnamese regiment covering its western flank. Same flat ground, same hedgerows, same paddy standing in the same water. Resistance in the first hamlet was slight. At about 11:30, the leading companies came under heavy fire out of the village ahead, and just before 1 o'clock, the North Vietnamese counterattacked from it. An air observer told Jarman that 500 of the enemy were forming to come around his position. Reinforcement was asked for and given. 2 companies from another battalion, flown in by helicopter to a landing zone near Thuong Do. Jarman described his own situation as relatively routine, while air and artillery worked the village in front of him. About 6 in the evening, the enemy broke contact. By 2 o'clock the following afternoon, the village was taken, most of the North Vietnamese having already gone north, and 3 men gave themselves up. Almost no reserve was left to the division by then. Tompkins had asked permission in advance to bring a 2-battalion brigade of the Airmobile Cavalry Division east out of an operation it was running in the hills, and now he brought it in. The reasoning was in the machines. A brigade with its own helicopters could patrol wide ground and put troops quickly onto whatever it found, and what it was looking for was an enemy withdrawing in small formations. At 5:15 on the evening of the 6th of May, the first of its battalions came down in a zone 3,000 meters east of the Marines. On the 9th, the brigade took over the sector. The 3rd Marines resumed control of their own units, and Jarman's battalion went back south of the Cua Viet, to the ground it had held before. A new operation opened the same day in a strip cut out between the South Vietnamese to the west and the Marines to the east. One more attack came. On the 10th of May, in the sector northeast of Dai Do, the North Vietnamese came at the American positions before dawn, and by the middle of the afternoon, it was over. After that, instead of working south to close the Cua Viet and perhaps come at Dong Ha, the 320th Division was breaking into small groups, doing their best to make their way north into the demilitarized zone. Operations in the Strip ended on the 17th of May. The enemy offensive, in the words of the record, had petered out. 3 officers of the battalion were decorated for what happened in those hamlets. Lieutenant Colonel Weiss received the Navy Cross, which stands second only to the Medal of Honor. Captains Vargas and Livingston were awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions in the Dai Do battles. The record puts it in the plural, and the plural is accurate. Award citations are dry documents, and these two keep the shape of the thing. The period named in Vargas's citation is the 30th of April to the 2nd of May. The same 3 days, counted the same way. Livingston's names one day, the 2nd of May, and the village that the enemy had taken the evening before, and the Marine company that was cut off inside it when he went in. What is in them otherwise is ground. 500 meters of open rice paddy crossed under fire. Smoke put out to cross it with. Companies combined into one attack, and a foothold in 2 hedgerows on the edge of the village, held through a night of counterattacks. And when the hamlet was finally in hand, the destruction of over 100 mutually supporting bunkers in it. On the 21st of May, at a short change of command ceremony at Dong Ha, Major General Davis took over the 3rd Marine Division. Tompkins moved up to the headquarters above him as deputy commander. Davis had held the Medal of Honor since Korea, and his view of the division he was taking over was that it had become tied down to its fixed positions and too defense-minded. The 320th Division came back the same night. It had been gone just 9 days, in Davis's phrase, and it came back to welcome him the night he took command. This time the Marines were ready for it, and the second attempt, from the 22nd to the 30th of May, did not get as far as the first had. What the division had spent shows up in what the prisoners said, and nowhere else. Men taken in the later fighting were well equipped and less experienced. Their discipline was poorer, and they gave up more readily than the ones taken before. One captured sergeant said that of the 90 men in his company, 62 were new. Another, taken near Lai An, said his unit had lost most of its strength since it crossed the Ben Hai River. Weiss's own conclusion about Dai Do came with its warning attached and would not stand without it. Body counts, he said, are always suspect. Cut the figures in half for inflation, he said. And then look at what is left. What was left, in his words, was the equivalent of 2 enemy regiments decimated in that area. Tompkins had good reason to believe when it was over that the 320th Division would not be a serious threat to the Allied positions along the demilitarized zone for some time to come. General Rawson, years afterward, put the same fact the other way round. A substantial part of the division got away, reorganized, and was back in a matter of days. Davis, passing his judgment to a brigadier general at the higher headquarters, said the division had missed a great opportunity and had let the North Vietnamese get away. The question underneath it, whether more mobile operations and a real effort to reinforce the battalion at Dai Do would have trapped more of the 320th, is one the official history asks and then declines to answer, on the ground that hindsight makes it easy. There is a case on the other side, and the same history makes it. Tompkins and his staff had had their attention fixed elsewhere since the beginning of the year. He had inherited the barrier line along the zone and the standing pressure from above to hold it. And in those very days, he had reason to think the enemy's main effort might fall on another part of his front. What changed came quickly. Davis ordered the strong points thinned. Positions held by battalions became positions held by companies, and the battalions freed up by it became swing units, to be lifted by helicopter to wherever something was found. About what the enemy had meant to do, questions remain. What the record notes is that the 320th Division apparently fired early on the shipping in the Cua Viet, before all of its units were in position, and in doing so gave itself away and set off the response against it. Once engaged, it showed tenacity and little imagination, and no answer to the American advantage in men, equipment, and supporting arms. It did not cut the river. It went north in small parties through the second half of May, and it stayed out of the war along the demilitarized zone for the 2 months that followed. The river went back to work almost at once. The boats had never really stopped. Through the first days of May, the landing craft came up on the tide as they had before, past the same bank, and by the end of the month the traffic was ordinary again. Ammunition, fuel, rations, mail. The barrels for the guns. What the division had been afraid of losing it did not lose, and the losing of it would have been quiet. No assault on the crossing, only a week of shipping that could not move. By June, the men along that bank were patrolling rather than attacking. The regiment worked both sides of the water and the creeks that fed it, keeping the passage open and keeping the enemy back from the places a rocket could be fired from. There were contacts, small ones with small groups. Nothing like May. 2 other jobs came with it, and they say more about the ending than any account of the fighting. The first was the harvest. Patrols went down along the coast that summer to cover the rice coming in. The paddy that men had crossed in the open, 300 and 400 meters of it at a time, was cut and carried that June by the people who farmed it. It was the same water and the same mud. The season simply arrived, the way it does. The second was dredging. Engineers began deepening the channel of the Cua Viet, and the regiment guarded the equipment and the men who ran it. The river that had been worth the division's attention in April was being made deeper in the summer, so that more could come up it faster. That is what the fight had been about, stated plainly, and without anyone saying so. The units moved on. In late June, the regiment that had relieved the battalion handed the sector to another and went south to refit. The battalion itself stayed on the coast into June and then left the flat country altogether. By August, it was in the hills to the west, 100 kilometers from any paddy, working a valley and then lifting out by helicopter to a base that had just been given a new name. The 2 landing battalions went back aboard their ships. Along the zone, the strong points were thinned out. Positions that had held a battalion now held a company, and the men freed up were kept ready to be flown wherever something was found. Later, 2 of the strong points were closed altogether. The operation itself ran on to the 9th of December, and then ended, and the ground it had covered was folded into another with a new name, centered on the same water. And the villages stayed where they were. Through the winter, mechanized patrols and foot patrols worked the bank between the hamlets, west of the river mouth, and went out at night to lie in ambush along the tracks. They found bunkers and destroyed them. Some were old and falling in, the roof sagging. The earth washed down into the holes. Others had been dug recently, the spoil still sharp at the edges, the timber still pale. The men who found them met no one at all. That is the picture to leave with. Not the crossing of the open ground, and not the count that came afterward. Just a stretch of bank a few miles long, with hedgerows along it and dry ground standing a little above the paddy. Earth walls that had been there before anyone arrived and were still there when everyone had gone. And holes in the ground, some collapsing and some new with nobody in them. The names went on being used. Dai Do turns up in a staff document that December, not as a battle but as a corner of a map. The western edge of somebody's area, a place a boundary runs to. Mai Sha O Be Mai Lok Dong Huan, written down by clerks who were not there in the spring to describe where one unit's responsibility stopped and another's began. Downstream, the outposts kept their watch on the zone, within a kilometer of it, looking north with binoculars and with radar, calling fire on movement, on bunkers, on tracks worn into the grass, on sampans and small boats, going where boats were not supposed to go. The men who had taken the villages were mostly somewhere else by then. The battalion had gone west into the hills, and the ground it crossed in the spring was being farmed by summer, and neither had anything to do with the other. That is usually how it goes. A place is fought over because of what runs past it. Afterwards, the thing that runs past it goes on running, and the place goes back to being a place. The water kept moving past all of it, brown and slow, 8 miles from the sea to the crossing, carrying what needed to come up. Sleep well,